Welcome to the channel. Before we step into the smoky VIP rooms of 1966 New York and witness a betrayal that changed music history, I have a small request. If you believe that rock and roll was at its best when it was dangerous, unpredictable, and impossible to control, then you are in the right place. We are building a community here for those who remember the feedback, the analog warmth, and the legends who walked among us. So, please, take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It helps us keep these stories alive against the algorithm, just like Jimmy fought against the machine. Now, let's head to the Cheetah Club. The Rolling Stones are on tour, but the real action is happening in the shadows. In the spring of 1966, Keith Richards was not just a guitarist, he was a deity. The Rolling Stones were riding the crest of a tidal wave with hits like I Can't Get No Satisfaction, and Paint It Black. They were the bad boys of rock, the dark antithesis to the Beatles' Sunshine. And on Keith's arm was the ultimate accessory of the era, Linda Keith. Linda was striking. A Vogue model with dark, heavy-lidded eyes, razor-sharp cheekbones, and an intellect that terrified the average rock star. She was the daughter of a prominent British radio host, steeped in music culture, and possessed of a taste level that was arguably more refined than Keith's own. She introduced Keith to blues records he had never heard. She was his muse, his confidant, and the keeper of the cool. But Linda was also bored. The Rolling Stones machine was a grinding, repetitive beast of tours, screaming girls, and hotel rooms. While Keith was off conquering America on the Stones' 1966 tour, Linda found herself alone in New York City, a 20-year-old woman with time to kill, connections to burn, and a hunger for something real. New York in '66 was a pressure cooker. The folk scene was dying, the psychedelic scene was birthing, and the clubs were full of pretenders. Linda, with her impeccable British pedigree and her status as Keith Richards' girl, had access to every VIP room in the city. But the VIP rooms were full of sycophants. She wanted music. One night in May, she wandered into a club called The Cheetah, on Broadway and 53rd Street. It was a cavernous, disco-style venue, not the kind of place a blues purist would usually frequent. On stage was a band called Curtis Knight and the Squires. They were a solid R&B outfit, wearing matching plaid jackets, playing the hits of the day for people to dance to. It was competent, professional, and entirely forgettable. Except for the guitar player in the back. He was standing in the shadows, dressed in the same goofy plaid jacket as the rest of the band, looking visibly uncomfortable. But when he took a solo, the room seemed to tilt. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was attacking them. He was playing with his teeth. He was playing behind his head. But beyond the tricks, there was a ferocity in his phrasing that made the hair on Linda's arms stand up. She stopped dancing. She walked to the front of the stage and stared. The guitarist was playing a battered, cheap Fender Duosonic that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. He couldn't stay in tune. He was fighting the instrument. But the sound was unlike anything Keith Richards, Brian Jones, or even Eric Clapton could produce. His name, she learned later that night, was Jimmy James. But the world would soon know him as Jimi Hendrix. After the set, Linda invited him to her table. The dynamic was jarring. Here was Linda Keith, the epitome of swinging London chic, dripping in expensive jewelry, the girlfriend of a Rolling Stone. And sitting across from her was this shy, stuttering, impoverished black musician who was living in a roach-infested hotel room in Harlem. Jimmy was mesmerized by her. Not just because she was beautiful, but because she listened. She talked to him about the blues. She talked about Bob Dylan, an artist Jimmy obsessed over but felt he couldn't emulate because he couldn't sing. Linda, with the brutal honesty of a true critic, told him, "Dylan can't sing either, darling. It's about the truth." That night, a bond was formed that would shatter the existing hierarchy of rock. Linda realized two things immediately. First, this man was a genius who was rotting away in a backing band. Second, he needed help. He needed better management, he needed a better stage, and most importantly, he needed a better guitar. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Midwest, Keith Richards was playing to sold-out arenas, unaware that the tectonic plates of his life were shifting. He trusted Linda. He assumed she was shopping, partying, waiting for him to return. He didn't know that she had found a new project. The irony is palpable. Keith Richards prided himself on being a blues purist, a man who worshipped Muddy Waters and Robert Johnson. He believed he was the custodian of that flame. And yet, his own girlfriend had just discovered the man who would take that flame and turn it into a flamethrower, incinerating the very style of playing Keith had spent years perfecting. Linda didn't see this as a betrayal. She saw it as a duty to art. She brought Jimi back to her hotel suite at the Hilton. It was a suite paid for by Rolling Stone's money. And in the corner of that room, sitting in its velvet-lined case, was a white Fender Stratocaster. It belonged to Keith Richards. He had left it behind for Linda, or perhaps as a spare. It was a pristine instrument, perfectly set up, miles ahead of the junk Jimi was playing. Linda opened the case. The white paint gleamed under the hotel lights. She looked at Jimi, whose eyes were wide with desire. "Pick it up," she said. The moment Jimi Hendrix laid hands on Keith Richards' white Fender Stratocaster, the universe shifted gears. Up until this point, Jimi had been wrestling with inferior instruments, guitars that wouldn't stay in tune, pickups that buzzed, actions that were too high. He was a race car driver trying to win the Grand Prix in a tractor. But Keith's guitar? This was a precision tool. It was set up for a Rolling Stone. The action was low and buttery. The electronics were pristine. In the quiet of Linda Keith's hotel suite at the New York Hilton, Jimi plugged it into a small practice amp. He didn't play a song, he played a feeling. He explored the neck with a reverence that bordered on religious. Linda watched from the sofa, smoking a cigarette, witnessing a transformation. With a proper instrument, Jimi's stuttering disappeared. His ideas flowed directly from his brain to the amplifier without the friction of mechanical failure. He fell in love with the Stratocaster that night, its contours, its balance, the way the single-coil pickups cut through the air like a knife. He decided then and there that this would be his weapon. It is a supreme irony that the signature instrument of the Jimi Hendrix experience was discovered in the case of the man he was about to eclipse. Keith Richards was unknowingly arming his own assassin. Linda was convinced she had found the next messiah of rock. She needed to prove it to the world, and specifically, to the Rolling Stones' inner circle. She called Andrew Loog Oldham, the Stones' legendary manager and producer. Oldham was the man who had manufactured the Stones' bad boy image to rival the Beatles. He was cynical, sharp, and obsessed with image. "You have to see him, Andrew," Linda pleaded. "He's better than Keith. He's better than anyone." Intrigued by Linda's intensity, Oldham agreed to see Jimi play at a club. The anticipation was palpable. Linda believed that Oldham would sign Jimi on the spot, perhaps even putting him on tour with the Stones. Imagine that lineup, the Rolling Stones opening for Jimi Hendrix? Or vice versa. The history of the 60s would have been rewritten. But when Oldham arrived, he didn't hear the genius, he saw the wrongness. He saw a black musician with wild, unkempt hair, dressed in mismatched clothes, playing loud, distorted feedback that sounded like noise to his pop-tuned ears. Oldham was looking for a package, a look, a British Invasion-style product. Jimi was too raw, too American, too different. Oldham watched for a few songs, grimaced, and walked out. "I can't do anything with him, Linda," he reportedly said. "He's just noise." It stands as one of the most catastrophic misjudgments in music business history. The man who managed the Stones walked away from the man who would define the electric guitar, leaving him in the dust. Most people would have given up. But Linda Keith was stubborn. She was furious at Oldham's blindness. She took it upon herself to be Jimmy's protector. She realized that New York was killing him. He was signing terrible contracts with small-time soul labels for $10, selling his publishing rights for a hamburger. Linda physically intervened. She stopped him from signing more bad deals. She bought him clothes. She fed him. And most importantly, she went to Manny's Music on 48th Street and bought him his own white Fender Stratocaster, a replacement for the one he had to leave in Keith's hotel room. She was arming him for the war to come. She knew she needed a British perspective, someone who understood the blues explosion happening in London. The Stones had passed, so she turned to The Animals. Chas Chandler, the bass player for The Animals, House of the Rising Sun, was in New York for the band's final tour. He was looking to transition from musician to manager. He told friends he was looking for a project, something fresh. Linda cornered him at a club called the Phone Booth. "I have found a guy," she told him. "You have to see him. Trust me." Chas was skeptical. Everyone in New York had found a guy. But he trusted Linda's taste. She took him to the Café Wa in Greenwich Village for a matinee show. The club was half empty. Jimmy was on stage, playing a slow, grinding version of a folk song called Hey Joe. The contract on a napkin. Chas Chandler froze. He had been looking for a singer to record a rock version of Hey Joe for months. He had the song in his head, but he needed the voice. And here was this unknown guitarist, not only singing it perfectly but deconstructing the guitar parts in a way that defied physics. Chas waited until the set was over and practically ran to the stage. He didn't care about the image. He didn't care about the wild hair. He saw the raw power. "I want to take you to London," Chas said. Jimmy looked at him, skeptical. He had heard promises before. "I'll go," Jimmy said, dropping his condition, "but only if you introduce me to Eric Clapton." Chas smiled. "I can do that." While all this was happening, Keith Richards was on his way back to New York. The tour was ending. He was returning to his hotel suite, to his guitar, and to his girlfriend. He had no idea that while he was playing Satisfaction to screaming teenagers in the Midwest, his girlfriend had effectively built a Frankenstein's monster in his own living room. Linda helped Jimmy pack. She knew he had to leave. New York would swallow him whole. London was the future. She sent him off with Chas Chandler, watching as the plane took off, carrying her discovery across the Atlantic. When Keith returned, he found his guitar case where he left it. But the magic inside it had been duplicated. He found Linda, but she was distant, her mind on the revolution she had just jump-started. Keith sat on the sofa, strumming his Stratocaster, unaware that in a few weeks, a man named Jimi Hendrix would land in London and make that very instrument sound obsolete. The king was back in his castle, but the usurper was already gathering his army. September 1966. Jimi Hendrix landed at Heathrow Airport with a plastic bag of toiletries, a change of clothes, and a borrowed guitar. He was a complete unknown in a country that worshipped Eric Clapton as a god. But thanks to Linda Keith's persistence and Chas Chandler's management, he had a foot in the door. Within 48 hours, the rumors started to spread like wildfire through the pubs of Soho. "There's a wild man from America," they whispered. "He plays with his teeth. He makes Clapton look like a librarian." The Rolling Stones were back in town, resting after their grueling American tour. Keith Richards was back in his Chelsea mansion, reunited with his guitars, but his relationship with Linda Keith was fraying. She was distant, erratic, and obsessed with this Jimmy character she had sent to London. Keith, in his trademark cool, dismissed it. He had heard about geniuses before. Everyone was the next big thing until they plugged in. He assumed this was just another of Linda's fleeting fascinations. But then, the invitations went out. A showcase gig at the Bag O'Nails. Everyone who was anyone would be there, the Beatles, The Who, the Hollies, and of course, the Rolling Stones. Keith decided to go. He wanted to see what all the fuss, and all the trouble with his girlfriend, was about. The club was dark, smelling of stale beer and expensive cologne. Keith Richards sat in a booth, a cigarette dangling from his lips, wearing his skepticism like a suit of armor. Brian Jones, the Stones' other guitarist, was there too, looking fragile and wasted. Mick Jagger was preening. They were the kings of London. They owned this town. Then, the lights dimmed. A lanky figure with an afro bigger than the venue's ceiling walked onto the tiny stage. He plugged into a Marshall stack that looked dangerously oversized for the room. He didn't say, hello. He hit a chord. It wasn't a chord, it was a bomb. Jimmy launched into Killing Floor. The speed, the aggression, the sheer volume was physically painful. Keith Richards sat up straight. The cigarette burned down to his fingers, unnoticed. He watched as Jimmy's hands blurred over the fretboard of a white Stratocaster, a guitar that looked hauntingly familiar to the one sitting in Keith's own hotel room back in New York. Jimmy wasn't just playing blues, he was dismantling it and rebuilding it in 3D. He was doing things Keith couldn't do. Things Keith hadn't even thought of doing. Keith was a rhythm player, a master of the groove, a disciple of Chuck Berry. But this? This was fluid, liquid fire. It was lead playing that breathed. For the first time in years, Keith Richards felt mortal. The coolest man on earth realized he had been surpassed. The look on his face, captured in the memories of those present, wasn't anger. It was a sobering realization. The game had changed. The bar had been raised so high that he couldn't jump it, he would have to walk under it. The gig was the final nail in the coffin of Keith and Linda's relationship. Linda had been right. She had betrayed Keith's trust, used his money, and perhaps even borrowed his gear to nurture another man's talent, but she had been right about the art. Jimmy was the future. The confrontation, when it came, was messy. Linda was spiraling into her own drug dependency, fueled by the intense pressure of the scene. Keith, realizing he had lost her heart to the music of another man, reportedly told her father about her drug use to save her, an act of tough love that ended their romance permanently. Linda Keith was taken back to England by her father, effectively removed from the chessboard. But her mission was accomplished. She had delivered the Holy Grail to London. She had sacrificed her relationship with a Rolling Stone to give the world Jimi Hendrix. It is one of the greatest, most selfless acts of A&R, artists and repertoire, work in history, yet she is rarely credited. How did Keith Richards react to this humbling? Did he try to outshred Jimmy? Did he buy more pedals? No. Keith was smarter than that. He realized that if he tried to compete with Hendrix on Hendrix's terms, speed, feedback, lead gymnastics, he would lose. So, Keith went the other way. While Jimmy went to space, Keith went back to the dirt. He abandoned standard tuning. He discovered the open G tuning, removing the bottom E string, a style that allowed him to play thick, ringing chords that sounded like a brass section. He focused entirely on rhythm, on the riff. He became the human riff. While Jimmy was recording the psychedelic symphonies of Axis, Bold as Love, Keith was writing the gritty, driving riffs of Jumpin' Jack Flash and Honky Tonk Women. It was a strategic retreat. He ceded the territory of Guitar Hero to Jimmy and Clapton, and claimed the territory of rock and roll soul for himself. Years later, after Jimmy was gone, Keith would speak about him with a mixture of admiration and distance. Jimmy was like a beautiful fireworks display, Keith said. Amazing to watch, but it burns out quickly. We, the Stones, are like a fireplace. We keep burning. It was a defensive statement, yes. But it was also an admission. Keith knew he couldn't burn as bright as Jimmy, so he chose to burn longer. The arrival of Jimi Hendrix forced Keith Richards to redefine who he was. It stripped away the arrogance of being the best, and forced him to find a unique voice that didn't rely on technical virtuosity. Jimi Hendrix died 4 years later, in 1970. Keith Richards is still touring today. But that night in 1966 remains a pivot point. The white Stratocaster that Linda Keith put in Jimi's hands became Excalibur. It wasn't just a guitar, it was a torch passed from the old guard to the new. Keith Richards lost his girl. He lost the title of Best Blues Player in London. He even lost the bragging rights to his own guitar model. But in that loss, he found the grit that would sustain the Rolling Stones for another 50 years. Sometimes, getting humbled is the only way to survive. Linda Keith was never just a groupie. She was the architect. She looked at the king, saw he was complacent, and brought in a voodoo child to wake him up. And for that, every rock fan owes her a debt. The amplifiers have finally cooled down, and the smoke has cleared from the bag o' nails. But the question remains, was Linda Keith the ultimate traitor, or the ultimate hero of rock history? She broke a Rolling Stone's heart to give us Jimi Hendrix. Would you have made the same choice for the sake of the music? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, I read every single one of them. And if this story of love, betrayal, and six-string redemption resonated with you, please like this video and share it with a friend who knows that behind every great solo, there's usually a broken heart. Until next time, keep the feedback ringing. I'll see you in the next chapter.